Greetings, Emmett here from ReadingforWisdom.com. Regular viewers will know that power and leadership are key interests to this series, and we write a lot about it on our website. And this has really been fostered by a lifelong interest in history. And when I was a young chap, one of the dominant themes, certainly the way we were taught and we learned history, was through the lens of the great man or the great woman. That was the great leader in history theory, that effectively things were determined by the actions and wills of strong men and strong women. That idea was replaced by Marxists, by determinists, people who strongly held that history was determined by impersonal forces, by economics, by geography, by class, these other sorts of effects that had nothing to do with the will of great men and great women. However, when looking at the determinist view of history, one only has to introduce one name to show and to prove that, in fact, world events, world history has a lot to do with the wills of strong men and strong women. That figure, Napoleon Bonaparte. Napoleon Bonaparte, though he only ruled France and its empire for 15 years, has an impact beyond that of a single man, an impact that has lasted still to this very day. He changed the map of Europe. He changed the legal systems of Europe and across the world. He changed and brought revolutions to the way warfare was conducted, to the way states were run, to the way the state centralized and organized itself. He brought changes to arts and culture, and his impact has been felt time after time. We only have to look at the 20th century, to the Mussolinis, to the Hitlers, to some of the dictators in Africa, and some of the dictators to this very day still follow the Napoleonic blueprint. And Napoleon Bonaparte is a figure that has been arguably written about more than any other historical figure, and I'm including Jesus Christ in that. There are tomes and tomes and tomes of books in many, many languages, huge amounts of volumes in French, but many, many volumes in the English language about Napoleon. And these works look at Napoleon in lots of different lights. Some of them are very hagiographic, some of them praising this great man to the hilt, others very critical, others quite balanced. In the critical category firmly sits a great British writer, Paul Johnson. And Paul Johnson in 2002 released this wonderful study of Napoleon Bonaparte. And Paul Johnson is a unique individual to write about Napoleon, I think, because he is such a polymath. He's such a broad thinker. He has written many, many books throughout his long, long career. Paul Johnson, still writing today, is well into his 90s. And he has written on subjects like intellectualism. Here's a great volume by him on the history of intellectuals. Not a particularly complimentary book. He's written huge volumes on modern history. He's written huge volumes on the history of Britain, the history of the Jewish people. So he's a great, broad mind. And he brings to Napoleon some real clarity. Now, first of all, he is great at telling the story of Napoleon, his rise, his fall, his rise again, and his fall. He's great at telling you, without going into too unnecessary details, the history of his conquests, his battles, his changes to the way France was governed. But he is mostly a puncturer of myths. He takes great aim at some of the things that have been said and claimed for Napoleon and punctures these one after the other. He does, of course, admit the great enthusiasm, energy, intellect, power of thinking, decisiveness that Napoleon brought. But he's very critical about what he did. He's very critical about his legacy. Ultimately, Johnson, a conservative writer, I think it would be fair to bracket him, is an enemy of totalitarians. He is an enemy of oppressors. He is an enemy of ideologues. And this is really what Paul Johnson has a go at, is Napoleon's legacy to ideology, to totalitarianism, to dictatorship. And an interesting thing that Johnson holds in the book is that Napoleon was no good for France either. And he has quite a bit of time pondering the French attitude to Napoleon, which is wholly reverent. Napoleon almost sits at the top of the pantheon of French heroes and is treated almost as a demigod in some respects within the current French Republic, and has been like that since midway through the 19th century. But one of the central things that Johnson argues is that Napoleon Bonaparte actually didn't really have an awful lot of time for France. He used it, and of course he wasn't French. He was Corsican, of Italian descent, and he almost had, and I think Johnson argues this quite well, almost had a contempt for France. And he does argue that he left France in a terribly, terribly depleted state after his constant rampage through Europe, his constant wars. So Johnson has a lot to say about Bonaparte's character. Here's a passage that talks about his military prowess. Bonaparte was first and foremost a military man, a soldier, a general, a commander of armies, and a deadly destroyer of his opponent's military capacity. His aim throughout his career was to move swiftly to a position where he obliged the enemy to fight a major battle, destroy the enemy's forces, and then occupy his capital and dictate peace terms. That is what he invariably did when he had any choice in the matter. He was absolutely consistent in his grand strategy, and on the whole it served him very well. It fitted his temperament, which was audacious, hyperactive, aggressive, and impatient of results. Indeed, impatience was his salient characteristic, serving him for both good and ill. As Wellington, who thoroughly understood Bonaparte's strengths and weaknesses, remarked, he lacked the patience to fight a defensive campaign. And even when he appeared to be doing so, in the winter of 1813-14, he was really looking for an opportunity to make an attack and win a decisive, aggressive battle. And one of the great myths that Johnson really pokes a big hole into is the myth of Napoleon as a great general. Now, there is no doubt that Johnson holds that Napoleon was a fantastic, brilliant, probably the greatest strategists, military strategists of all time. There is no doubt about his personal bravery. There is no doubt about his genius at the mechanics of war, the tactics of war. This is not in doubt. But actually the greatness that Johnson has a go at is leader of men. Because what Johnson shows is that Napoleon was merciless. He had no regard for his troops. He was very expedient about looking after them, very expedient about motivating them, but ultimately didn't care about their fate. He also didn't care about horses or animals. So let's have a little read of what Johnson has to say. Bonaparte himself set an example of speed. He was often seen flogging not only his own horse, but also that of his aide riding alongside him. His consumption of horsepower was unprecedented and horrifying. In the pursuit of speed by his armies, hundreds of thousands of these creatures died in their traces, driven beyond endurance. Millions of them died during his wars, and the struggle to replace them became one of his most formidable supply problems. The quality of French remounts deteriorated steadily during the decade of 1805 to 1815, and this helps to explain the declining performance of the French cavalry. But while Johnson's book is mainly focused on the character and the life of Napoleon Bonaparte, there is, of course, a great cast of characters that surround it. And Bonaparte's family make for some great reading. Johnson tells you a lot about them. Some of the members of the family, particularly some of his sisters, sounded like that they were, quite entertaining people. Some of his brothers were unfortunate in the shadow they fell under. His whole family he looked after very, very well, so that's one positive thing about his character, was he was certainly a family man. His wives, his treatment of them is certainly questionable by any modern standard. Some of the other characters, though, that jump out of the pages are equally entertaining. One of them is Joseph Fouché, and let's read a little passage about this master intriguer. Joseph Fouché was of coarser and baser material than Talleyrand, but had the same capacity to survive. A spoiled priest, he became a Jacobin deputy, a terrorist under Robespierre, survived the Thermidor coup, served the Directory as its Paris policeman, supported the Brumaire coup, and was rewarded with the job of chief of police to the Bonaparte regime, holding it until 1810. Fouché was not remotely loyal to anyone or anything, but he had a large staff, a big budget, and countless informants, and his service de renseignement, which covered all of Europe as well as France, but which was particularly active in Paris, was of irreplaceable value to Bonaparte and helped to keep him ahead of the game and in power. Bonaparte was never secure after Fouché's removal in 1810. Fouché had decided that the game was almost up and was systematizing his royalist contacts. This made him invaluable to France during the first debacle of 1814, when he helped to restore Louis XVIII while remaining in contact with Bonaparte in Elba. Head of police again during the 100 Days, he survived Waterloo and was once more in royal employment when the outrage of the returned émigrés obliged the king to exile. He died in Trieste in 1820, victim of such a ferocious bout of arthritis that it proved impossible to straighten his body up, and he was buried sitting up in his coffin. Fouché, who operated the world's first secret police force, and who was the prototype of Himmler or Beria, was an important element in Bonaparte's legacy of evil, for some of his methods were widely imitated in Austria and Prussia, where they became permanent, and even in harmless Sweden, where they were carried out by Bonaparte's Marshal Jean-Baptiste Bernadotte. So what a dreadful character, but a hugely influential figure, Joseph Fouché, and one of those figures to sparkle throughout the book. I think, though, sparkle might be the wrong term to use for such a character. But ultimately, one of the greatest revelations, I think, in the book is not only the legacy of evil, as he's termed it, that Johnson describes, but actually some of the big, big mistakes that Napoleon made over his career. Johnson portrays him almost as a conservative thinker, even though he was so revolutionary. He's quite conservative, quite hidebound. He never really quite got the sea, for example, which is why Napoleon and his empire ultimately suffered from the power of the British Navy, because he was never really interested in maritime affairs. Also, very importantly, he was never interested in the New World, the colonies of France, the colonies of Great Britain. And regarding the New World, he made some really interesting mistakes, some decisions that had a huge impact for a certain country, but a very negative impact for France and very negative impact for the future of the empire. Let's have Johnson tell us a little bit about the Louisiana Purchase. The Louisiana Purchase must rate as Bonaparte's greatest single failure of imagination. "You have made a princely bargain," said Talleyrand to the Americans, not without a note of sadness. It was true. Louisiana comprised 828,000 square miles, subsequently becoming 13 states. France was paid $15 million, or 4 cents an acre. If Bonaparte had used France's legitimate rights to its American territory to explore and create an enormous dominion across the Atlantic, instead of trying to carve out an illegitimate empire in Europe, he would have enriched France instead of impoverishing her, provided scope for countless adventurous young Frenchmen instead of killing them in futile battles, and incidentally inflicted more damage on his British opponents than all his efforts in Europe. He would also have changed the globe permanently, something his career failed to achieve in the end. But he knew nothing of America, and desired to know nothing until it was too late. He feared the Atlantic as a great ocean. He averted his eyes from the entire ship of the world to fasten them exclusively on its European cockpit, and thus, in this respect, betrayed his narrow, insular Corsican origins. So, the United States was the power that permanently benefited most from the Bonapartist epoch. All I really have to say is read this book. And this book is not just a history book, because it's a book that has something to tell us about today, about the modern state, about modern society, about modern leadership. And it could be argued that this is the man who invented it, a man who, for good or for ill, has had a huge impact on world history, certainly a great man in history. And this read is made all the more powerful, of course, by Johnson. Johnson, that wonderful polymath, great thinker, ultimately a really good human being who punctures myths, who really, and this is probably the strength of the book, who pokes at the heart of the fallacies of romantic thinking, of ideological bound thinking. That's the strength of this book. If you enjoy the type of books that we're reviewing on this program, please do give us a like, subscribe to our channel, and down below you'll find some more information about readingforwisdom.com. Please do come over to our website. We'd love to have a visit from you, and we'll continue to post more videos and more content in the weeks ahead.